Everybody has a handout, because if you're hoping that the PowerPoint will tell you anything, you're going to be in for disappointment. Okay, the Roman historian Sallust opens his monograph on the Catilinarian conspiracy with a famous assertion, and that's item 1 on your handout. It behooves all men who wish to excel the other animals to strive with might and main not to pass for life unheralded, like the beasts which nature has fashioned grovelling and slaves to the belly. All our power, on the contrary, lies in both mind and body. We employ the mind to rule, the body rather to serve. The one we have in common with the gods, the other with the brutes. Therefore, I find it becoming in seeking renown that we should employ the resources of the intellect rather than those of brute strength, to the end that, since the span of life which we enjoy is short, we make the memory of our lives as long as possible. In other words, it's the ability to create a lasting memoria of oneself that sets a member of the human race apart from the animals. Animals, creatures condemned to be forgotten and passed over in silence, silentium, after their demise. This task, then, according to Sallust, ought to be achieved by the powers of the mind and inner disposition, ingenium, rather than by physical strength, vides, as this element of our overall constitutions brings out the divine aspect of human nature as opposed to the rather more worldly ones. Memoria, memory, is a notorious, a key concept for an understanding of Roman thought in general, and of the Roman epigraphic habit, the Roman attitude to inscribing the world they inhabit more specifically. The desire to generate a lasting memory of the deceased and their present whereabouts is the very driving force behind the design of any tombstone ever produced, regardless of how witty they may have been in denying just that notion in the text themselves. It is the driving force behind honorific inscriptions, behind inscriptions on built structures, and behind dedications. All of these texts ultimately reveal a deeply rooted anxiety to be forgotten, to have lived a life in silence, and this is true even for those who have the famous sentiment non fui, fui non sum, I wasn't, I was, I am not, inscribed on their monuments. And while we're on the topic of monuments, the very concept of a monument, monumentum, is of course that of a potentially eternal preservation of memory, etymologically derived from the verb monere, to remind. Monumentum thus is a petrified reminder, petrified human memory. Usually such petrified reminders, monumenta, are man-made. But there are exceptions, and the Campanian settlements at Pompeii and Herculaneum, obliterated and wiped off the surface of the inhabited earth by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in AD 79, are well-known examples for that. Since they were first excavated, these places have become monuments in their own right, reminders not only of the fragile nature of the human condition in a threatening, uncontrollable world, but recording and preserving evidence for the life and death in a Roman town of the first century in an otherwise virtually unparalleled configuration and level of completeness. Traces of the inhabitants of these settlements are plentiful, and among the best known of such traces is the wealth of wall inscriptions, the dipinti and graffiti, carefully recorded in the collection of the 4th volume of the, dare I say, monumental Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum. These texts continue to inspire scholars and members of the public alike, as they seem to be such an obvious parallel to our own desire to leave written traces of our existence in places that are not meant or designed to carry this piece of ultimately vain information. We get excited when we find something that ties us more firmly to the tradition of Western European civilization from thousands of years ago. It appears to give a sense of purpose, meaning, and tradition. In that respect, the graffiti and dipinti too have been transformed from casual writings, not necessarily designed to last for very long, or in some cases to be read at all, into monumental inscriptions to a certain extent, namely insofar as they preserve the memory of the writers, whether professional or just random and casual, and their utterances. The remainder of this paper will work forward from this notion, and I will unpick some ideas related to the fleeting nature of the graffiti of Pompeii, while making an attempt to come up with an analysis of the discourse of these texts, examining the essential role of the adverb and deictic index hic here. The term deictic, as well as the related noun deixis, are used loosely by classicists, often in the context of analyses of dramatic language, but also in the context of Latin inscriptions. Deixis can be understood as a technical term for pointing at things with words, obviously a Greek noun, derived from the verb deiknemi, to point out, to show. This is not an altogether problematic approach, except that one must be aware of the fact that deixis is also a linguistic category, a category that becomes relevant in the context of the sub-area of modern linguistics that is commonly called pragmatics. What on earth am I talking about? Well, pragmatics is an area that in simple terms works forward from the assumption that speaking is a form of action, and that this action is influenced, informed, and to some extent determined by a wide range of contextual factors. Utterances become speech acts, and the context of these speech acts generates meaning. In that respect, words that we tend to take for granted to have meaning become a rather more interesting concept. So let us assume, just for argument's sake, that two people engage in a discussion. Let us call them Peter and Paul, which incidentally is the name of my son. Now, when Peter says, "Paul, I really would like you to tidy up that mess in your room," the constituent I to Peter signifies Peter. The same applies to Paul's understanding of the term, for he is likely to respond, "You've already said this twice, but I'm not going to do that now." In that case, however, I signifies Paul. To Paul, even though only just a fraction of a second ago it meant Peter. So the subject pronoun in that example just now is a constituent that cannot easily be explained by the means of semantics, as in the assumption that meaning is encoded in the words themselves. Not even when we use a rather wishy-washy definition such as this pronoun replaces a personal name and refers back to the subject agent of a first person utterance. Why is this? The following example provides further insight. Imagine you find a piece of paper, and said paper have the following words written on it: "I love you." Now, if semantics were a useful concept in that scenario, strictly speaking, you would have to assume that said piece of paper had developed romantic feelings for its reader. Possible, of course, but not very likely. Words like I, or here, or then are relative to the discourse that they form a part of, and they point in certain directions relative to the position of the speaker and the interlocutor. In that respect, it is sensible to use the descriptor deictic for them. Deixis in discourse needs what is called a deictic center that is dependent on the first person subject agent. This entity defines the I, the now, and the here. Relative to this deictic center, there are a number of ways in which deixis can operate. It can be spatial, temporal, and of course it can be personal, as already encountered in the opposition of I and you in my last example. One can add discourse deixis. This would cover the range of demonstrative pronouns, for example, and social deixis, as in terms that clarify the relationship and the level of politeness or respect between speaker and interlocutor. Commonly summarized actually under the label of a TV distinction, like in Latin tu and vos, in German du and sie, and you versus yous and y'all and you guys in certain regional variations of English. The choice of deictic terms, or indexes, then is determined by levels of proximity, closeness, and distance in relation to that center, to the deictic center. And at this point, I will now restrict my considerations to spatial deixis. That's the main interest of this paper. When it comes to spatial deixis, most languages that you're familiar with typically have 3 levels of proximity and distance. Here, there, and over there, or in archaic English, yonder. There are, however, languages with a rather wider range of spatial deictic indexes, depending on accessibility and visibility of the item in question, for example, aspects that we do not tend to qualify in spatial deictic expressions in English, German, or Latin, or ancient Greek. That does not mean, however, that an index is necessarily particularly static in its reference, quite the contrary. The same index can potentially stretch to a range of meanings. The term here, for example, has a rather narrow meaning in the phrase, "Here lies the body of someone," presumably a few feet underneath. But that's different from the phrase, "Here comes the bride," presumably at the far end of the church building. It also shows a different direction, right? Or, in fact, the phrase, "It tends to rain quite a lot here in England," where here's a completely fuzzy concept in its spatial extent, depending on where you actually are, but chances are you can go many miles in any directions, and it still means here. In that respect, it's worth asking just how far does hic, here, stretch in Latin, and how can the inscriptions of Pompeii help us to establish an understanding of the workings of the spatial index? The use of inscriptions as opposed to literary texts is particularly important for this, as extra-textual deixis utilizes the framework that is provided by the spatial realities of the settlement itself, rather than any fictive elements. And just as a disclaimer, the material that I'm going to present does not attempt complete coverage of the evidence, otherwise we'd sit here for several hours going through hundreds of instances. But I'll give you a representative overview of that. Which brings me to the main part of my paper. Around the time of the Second World War, a strange little graffito came about. It showed a face with an oblong nose, 2 eyes, and no visible mouth, of a person hiding behind a wall, sometimes with additional fingers visible, often accompanied by the words, "Kilroy was here." It is unlikely that in all, if in any cases, an actual Kilroy was there, it had turned into a running gag. And the graffito became widespread very quickly. Interestingly enough, first sightings of this type of in-joke were on vessels of the US naval forces, i.e. on movable objects, begging the interesting question, where exactly is here? When that ship leaves the harbor, for example. It would seem that the meaning of here in that context is exclusively supplied by the context of the vessel alone, regardless of its current position. Here, as in the very spot where I stood when I wrote this piece, not in a specific US Navy base as opposed to just off the French coast. So where exactly is that here? The desire to express one's being here is not a specifically modern one. Leaving one's mark, leaving a trace of one's existence in a certain place at a certain time is a desire much older than that. The graffiti of Pompeii, for example, contain dozens of cases that follow the format name plus hic plus an optional fuit, not erat, by the way. And the eponymous hero of this paper, and we're going to stare at a little longer, Aufidius, if that is his real name, wrote, and that's item 2 on your handout, Aufidius hic fuit vale, Aufidius was here, greetings. Now, Aufidius' whereabouts, the hic of this text can be identified with, to the right of the entrance of dwelling 539, the house of Cosmos and Epidia, as it has been called. Deixis-wise, the graffito itself provides the deictic center for the index hic, not in the very spot of the wall, of course, unless Aufidius mastered the art of superheroic wall climbing, but within an arm's length, so as to be able to leave this note. Something similar comes across rather firmly from the following insult, item 3 on your handout, Verus hic ubi stat nihil veri, this is Verus' spot where he stands, nothing stands. Now the pun on the name of Verus cannot easily be translated, and matters aren't helped by the double ellipsis of stat in the Latin, but it's obvious that hic refers to a very specific spot in the immediate vicinity of this text. and the level of proximity as determined by the index Hig is not equally close in all cases, however. In Bosca Reale, for example, in the immediate vicinity of Pompeii, a certain Cerdo was found to have left behind a handful of scribblings eternalizing his name at villa number 28. One of the items seems merely to assert Cerdo's presence, item number 4, Cerdo Hig. Unlikely that something actually dropped out here, I think. Cerdo was here. This is a case that would not appear to be fundamentally different from that of Aufidius, but a second graffiti of the same set reads as follows, item 5, Cerdo Hig bibit, Silvaticus vides. Cerdo drinks or drank here, Silvaticus, you see it, you're a witness. Is there any reason to believe that Cerdo drank in the immediate proximity to this spot where he left his little note? Or do we see a rather looser use of Hig in this case, potentially referring to the wider space, or maybe even the entire structure into which this text was inscribed, as in this general place rather than in this very spot? The whole issue is not helped, of course, by the use of the morphologically ambiguous form bibit, which could either denote the present tense or the perfect tense. In case of the former, the meaning of Hig might potentially be even looser than in the case of the perfect. One may find it easier to determine this for the following somewhat gross instance, item number 6 on your handout, secundus Hig kakat, Hig kakat, Hig kakat. Secundus poops here, poops here, poops here, or he poops, hard to determine. Easier, because in a different context of Pompeii, we get information that actually proceeding to a wall is what you do if you need to relieve yourself that way, either sort of inviting advance to the wall or go away from this particular wall. So while for bibit it is actually hard to decide whether or not the writer intended to use the present or past tense, it would appear to be equally good choices to my mind. In other cases of activities recorded for Hig, it would seem to be easier to determine this tense, even though the morphology is equally ambiguous. Consider the following, that's items 7 to 10 on your handout. Festus Hig futuit cum sodalibus, Ierinus Hig cum affetto futuit, ampliatus cum sodalibus Hig, ampliatus affer Hig futuit cum suis sodalibus. Discovered in the context of the inn, it's a Carpona and Thermopolium 1 to 20, these inscriptions give an indication of the activities that went on in that space, though it would appear to be unlikely that the inscriptions and their respective usages of Hig can be taken in a particularly narrow sense, based on the not altogether unfounded assumptions that the Pompeian too might have preferred beds for this type of activity to which the graffiti refer. So, just in this general locale, the same would seem to be true for another group of graffiti that commemorates someone's resting or staying in a specific place at Pompeii. We have item number 11, Marcus Attilius Hig stationem fecit. Marcus Attilius had a stopover here. Pacatus Hig cum suis mansit Pompeiis. Pacatus had a stopover here with his family at Pompeii. 13, Antiochus Hig mansit cum sua Cythera. Antiochus stayed here with his Cythera. The case of CIL 8660, that's item number 12, in particular makes it clear that Hig in this instance must be a rather narrower term than the locative Pompeiis, so in this area but somewhere in Pompeii. Leading on from that, I now would like to consider a number of items that show Hig in a wider sense, as opposed to a narrow one within an arm's length as well. I will thus talk about a set of inscriptions scattered across Pompeii, which refer to the dwelling of someone, as in permanent residence, as opposed to the passing through of the previous examples. The evidence remains incomplete just for brevity's sake. Item number 14, Aemilius Keller lives here. Aemilius Keller Hig habitat. 15, Circinius Hig habitat. Circinius lives here. And of course, with slight variation to the theme, Felix est Januarius Fuficius, qui Hig habitat. Januarius Fuficius, who lives here, is a lucky person. We also have examples for double occupancy tested. For example, in the inscriptions discovered in the house of Fabius Rufus, as aptly edited by Hegi Solin in the Neue Forschungen volume, item 17, Romula cum suo hic habitat, Romula lives here with her partner. 18, Romula cum suo hic habi, Romula lives here with her partner. And then there are, of course, indefinite numbers of occupants, making it somewhat more difficult to ascertain the deictic center. Two examples are items 19 and 20. Hic habitamus felices nos dii faciant. We live here, may the gods make us fortunate, and everyone lives here. That might be a big house. There's another problem, however, with these seemingly simple texts and their use of hic, and that is precisely the fuzzy nature of the spatial index itself. How far does it stretch? Does it mean the entire building? Does it signify a specific space in that building? In one case, we may have an indication, however. A convincing argument was proposed by Renata Senna-Gaffaroni and Ray Lawrence with regard to the following item 21 on your handout. Samus 1, drawing of Corona, 1, Momillo idem eques hic habitat, Samus 151 Victory, Momillo also an eques lives here. Now this text has been discovered in what has been explained to be the dining room of the so-called House of the Gladiators, 553, and it cannot easily be explained as the dwelling designed for anyone to inhabit. The graffito's placement in a room that was designed for the consumptions of foodstuffs and drinks, according to other inscriptions found in the same space, as well as in the overall layout of the room, make this inscription either Samus' nostalgic reminiscence of frequent happy times spent in this very room, or someone else's teasing joke designed to mock Samus publicly. At any rate, hic barely stretches beyond the walls of this very room. This is very different in the following case, 22. Bonus Deus hic habitat in domo acti. A good God lives here in the house of Actius. We would hope that this does not just refer to a single room. It would seem impossible to argue that he covers less than the entire domus. And something similar would apply to the following case, but one cannot be entirely certain. 23. Hic habitat felicitas. I was briefly tempted to put that on the screen, but I didn't. I'm sure you have all seen it. And I hope you'll be able to translate the Latin figura falli. It's exactly what you think it means. But it's not altogether clear whether felicitas refers to a female of that name and whose occupation would be appropriately captured in the illustrating symbol, or whether it is but an abstract concept of good fortune, rendering this text a good luck charm, which is commonly thought to be a more plausible explanation. The most peculiar case, however, is the following one, and you're probably tired of that, so I spend like 3 minutes coming up with 3 more slides, and we're going to look at them in like 1 minute. This one, which I'm sure you've all seen somewhere. Labyrinthus hic habitat Minotaurus, and the labyrinth. Now, the drawing of a labyrinth, which is a functioning one, by the way, that's researcher into this, you can actually go through it. It does work, but I won't distract you any further from that. The drawing of a labyrinth, in conjunction with the actual word labyrinthus present in the text, does not necessitate the assumption that hic refers to this very labyrinth. It does not suggest that the Minotaur actually lives in there. I certainly can't see him in there. I was tempted to draw that, but I gave up. So in that respect, hic in 1st century Pompeii may be in fact ancient Knossos. Unless we assume, as some have done, I believe, that A, the labyrinth may in fact be a humorous reference to the house to which it was attached, and B, Minotaurus was but a code name for the house's wild, inhumane occupant, for which you're looking at the evidence. Either way, one will have a hard time to corroborate these assumptions in any way. Now, the exact confines of the deictic center of hic in Pompeian wall inscriptions, as we have seen, are difficult to ascertain. There are limits to it, however, and we can tell this from the presence of other spatial deictic indexes that frequently appear coupled with hic, in particular ubique everywhere. Evidence for this is plentiful, and for the sake of time, it will be sufficient to adduce a small selection of examples. A good starting point can be identified in a dipinto promoting Marcus Quirinius Vatia's election to aedile, item 25 on your handout. Marcus Quirinius Vatia for aedile, he's worthy of this commonwealth. Messenius supports this, written by Infantio with Florus and Fructus and Sabinus here and everywhere. Considering the nature of the Pompeian electoral system, one can be safe in the assumption that hic et ubique offers a very clear-cut opposition for once. The deictic center of this instance of hic is the very dipinto we are looking at, whereas ubique refers to any level of distance between hic and the outer confines of the Pompeian voting area. This, of course, forms a nice contrast with a famous metrical inscription which utilizes a frequently attested sentiment, item number 26 on your handout, Venimus hic cupidi multo magis here cupimus ut liciat nostros viscera malares. We came here with great desire, rather more we now wish to leave, so that we may see our lares back in Rome, where huc forms a contrast with Roma, so it would appear to refer to all of Pompeii, most likely. Although, as I discussed in an article several years ago, this may not be at all the most common idea behind this otherwise frequently attested sentiment in other instances. Returning to hic, rather than huc, et ubique then, one can see the same type of distinction that occurred in the dipinto also applied to graffiti. So, for example, in item 27 on your handout, Crescens colonibus salutem hic et ubique, Crescens to the fullest, greetings here and everywhere, or in the rather more lavish words of Polyaeus Marsus, a bedroom attendant of the imperial household, item 28 on your handout, Polyaeus Augusti cubicularius Marsus hic et ubique salutem, sanctissimae coloniae et populi Pompeiano ubique salutem. Polyaeus Marsus, bedroom attendant of the emperor, gives us greetings here and everywhere, the most holy colony and the Pompeian people, greetings everywhere. Let me conclude this segment of my talk, however, with a quick visit to another bedroom scenario, namely back to the aforementioned Romula and her partner, whom we already found living in the house of Fabius Rubens. Well, surprise, as a matter of fact, they did not only live there, for so the following item 29 on your handout suggests Romula cum suo hic fellat et ubique. Romula engages in oral sex here with her partner and everywhere. Now, the frame of reference for hic has already been established in this case. The question is then, how far does ubique stretch for Romula and her suus? But that, of course, would be a very different paper. Let me conclude. The paper began with some rather existentialist remarks, reminding of Sallust's deep thoughts about the purpose of human life. Let us come back to that for just a short while, in lieu of an actual conclusions to my perfunctory comments on the use of spatial deixis and the index hic in the inscriptions of Pompeii. I suggested that, in a way, Pompeii itself, due to its peculiar conservation under layers of volcanic matter, has become a monument, a bearer of memoria, memory petrified. The walls of Pompeii and the wall inscriptions, as a result of this freak accident, speak to us as monuments that there were not supposed to be originally. Sallust says, only very briefly after his opening statement, that, item 30 on your handout, success in agriculture, navigation and architecture depends invariably upon mental excellence. Yet many men, being slaves to appetite and sleep, have passed through life untaught and untrained. Like many wayfarers, in these men we see, contrary to nature's intent, the body a source of pleasure, the soul a burden. For my own part, I consider the lives and deaths of such men about alike, since no record is made of either. What Sallust did not anticipate, however, is that randomly the fleeting notes of those whom he considered to be worthless could survive and thus turn into items of monumental value. This is the sole reason why we can still talk about a certain Floronius, for example, item 31 on your handout. Floronius binet ac miles legiones septimae hic fuit neque mulieris scierunt nisi paucae et ses erunt. Floronius binet. It's not quite clear what that means, actually. Jim Adams has suggested, so it's probably right, that this sort of sexual term, except I don't know how this works syntactically at this point. Others have tried to explain this as a military term, which also doesn't fully work, but whatever. So Floronius, soldier of the 7th Legion, was here, and the women did not know that, with the exception of a few, and they will be, or presumably were already, 6. Inscribed at a brothel's entrance, this inscription records the past or future sexual exploits of a person who easily qualifies for the category waste of space, according to Sallust. According to him, then, we should make no record of his life and his death. But Pompey did that for us. We have no record of his death, but we have a record of his life, deservedly or not, and it would be too easy to make fun of Floronius' dictic center here. De utraque siletur, Sallust says, one should remain silent about either aspect. I will follow his advice now. Certainly he, presumably not, ubique. Thank you very much.